Good afternoon, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Matthew Byer, and I am the Museum Education and Engagement Coordinator for the State Historical Museum of Iowa. The Iowa History 101 webinars share Iowa stories and the history of the state through a cultural historical lens on the second and fourth Thursdays of each month. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at iowaculture.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you would like to attend, and don't worry if you can't catch all live. All presentations will be recorded. Today, we will discuss some landmark scholarship about gender in Iowa's history. We'll examine several topics, including how gender shaped interactions among diverse peoples in Iowa's earliest years, how gender was central to life in rural small towns, and how activism for causes like temperance, women's suffrage, and civil rights emerged. Now, a few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker today. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are available by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in just a few days. I've disabled the chat function, but if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague Andrew Klump is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note we may not have time to get to all the questions. Now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today, Sara Egge. Sara Egge is a Claude D. Pottinger Professor of History at Center College in Danville, Kentucky. She graduated from Iowa State University's Agricultural and Rural Studies program, during which time she enjoyed living and studying in Iowa. At Center College, Sara teaches courses in environmental, gender, and early 20th century history. She has published articles in Agricultural History, Middle West Review, and the Annals of Iowa, and her scholarship on women's suffrage and citizenship became a book entitled Women's Suffrage and Citizenship in the Midwest, 1870 to 1920, which won the Benjamin Shabba Award for Best Book in Iowa History and the Gita Shahari Prize for the Western Association of Women Historians for the Best Book on Rural Women from Any Time and Any Place. Her current scholarship examines the history of naturalization in the United States. She also has written more articles about food in the Midwest than she ever has anticipated, and she hopes to continue pursuing research on that topic as well. Now I'm happy to turn it over to Sara to begin the webinar.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and I am delighted to be here with you all. Today, as we have said, we are going to be talking about the history of gender in Iowa and kind of some of the major points that have been raised by scholars, some of the major interventions that we have come to better grasp the history of Iowa with those in mind. I do have a couple of disclaimers before I begin. The first one is that I cannot possibly cover all of gender in Iowa in this session. There have been numerous scholars and historians who have engaged with this topic. So if you have questions about anything that I'm unable to address, please feel free to ask in the Q&A session at the end. Again, there's just so many wonderful pieces of scholarship, and I am indebted to my colleagues, those who have come before me and those who continue to work on this topic. The other thing I want to say is that what I'm going to do today is sort of take us in terms of scale from the individual and their stories and how those stories sort of amplify our understanding of gender in Iowa, both in terms of the narrative and the context of history, but also some of the theories, the ways of thinking about ourselves in this history in Iowa. And so just sort of giving you a sense of the framework, I think, is helpful and important. So one of the first things that I want to say about gender in Iowa is that when we take it seriously, we discover people who are often left out of the historical narrative. Someone like Charlotta Gordon Piles, a remarkable woman. I'm going to tell you a little bit about her. She was born in slavery. She was enslaved by the Gordon family on a large plantation in Kentucky, where I'm speaking to you from. She had 12 children. And her husband, Harry Piles, he was a free man. But under the laws of slavery, he had no legal authority to protect his own wife and children. So when she was 54 years old, Piles was finally granted her freedom, along with most of her family, and they made the difficult journey west from Kentucky to free territory, just as winter was setting in. The group ultimately settled in Keokuk, Iowa, and this group included Charlotta and Harry, 11 of their children, and 5 of their grandchildren. The family lived in a large brick house, which Harry built himself, and they belonged to the First Baptist Church of Keokuk. It was there that Charlotta and Harry were legally married in 1857, which was a right that had been denied to them while Charlotta was under slavery. Freedom, however, did not bring an end to the heartache for Charlotta and her family, because she was forced to leave behind one of her sons and 2 of her sons-in-law, so they remained in bondage. Charlotta was determined to purchase the freedom of her sons-in-law. She felt that because their wives and children were in freedom, they needed to be reunited together. She was also aware of the anti-slavery movement and the fugitive slave activists. She had been in those conversations, in those circles. And so she traveled to the East Coast as part of these movements to engage audiences and raise the necessary money to free them. She spoke in major cities like Philadelphia and New York, and she gained the attention of prominent figures. She met Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, and Lucretia Mott, all anti-slavery activists. Her granddaughter, a woman named Grace Morris Allen Jones, wrote the following about Charlotta. Quote, "It was a difficult task for a poor, ignorant woman who had never had a day's schooling in her life to travel thousands of miles in a strange country and stand up night after night and day after day before crowds of men and women, pleading for those back in slavery. So well did she plead, however, that in about 6 months she had raised the necessary $3,000, returned to Iowa, thence to Kentucky, where she bought 2 men from their owners and reunited them with their families." A woman like Charlotta Piles often does not get a lot of attention when we survey Iowa history. In fact, I didn't know about her the entire time I studied at Iowa State University, and only recently heard about her and incorporated her into an article I wrote to commemorate the 175th anniversary of Iowa's statehood, which is part of a collection, a special volume of the Annals of Iowa. And I wanted to put her first, because when we do, we become much more aware of the history of Iowa in its complexities. She is an extraordinary woman, and I think she helps us to really start to think deeply about how gender operates both individually and then as a broad system in the lives of Iowans. Another individual, if you can see the screen, you probably recognize this person. This is Carrie Chapman Catt. Catt, of course, born in Charles City, Iowa. She went to Iowa State Agricultural College, which was a co-educational public institution. There she gained education. She also was part of the debate society. And she actually famously formed a drill group of women. It was an all-female military drill group, and they were not allowed to carry weapons. But they did find some household objects to try to simulate the drills. Later on, she moved up to Mason City. She worked as a superintendent, and then later in newspaper business. She spent some time in California. She was married twice. Unfortunately, both of her husbands died, but she's probably most well known for her activism on behalf of women's suffrage. And when we look at her life, we can think very carefully about how, again, we think about Iowa history. Gender reveals that in this case, Iowans could be quite radical. They could be nationally prominent, and they could direct such significant movements that it revolutionized the Constitution of the United States. In this case, Carrie Chapman Catt served twice, from 1900 to 1904, and then again after 1916, as the president of the National American Woman Suffrage Association. And during her second tenure in that position, she shepherded, along with her colleagues, the 19th Amendment as part of the Constitution. And the reason why this amendment is so important is because for the first time, the Constitution acknowledged women. It used the term sex when it said that the right to vote shall not be denied or abridged on the basis of sex. But this is the first time in 1920 where the Constitution says anything about gender. And it's something I think we ought to really think carefully about in terms of the following decades of activism on behalf of gender equality, especially in terms of the legal history of the United States. Now, to be clear, this did not enfranchise, the 19th Amendment did not enfranchise all women. There are many states that continue to disenfranchise women and men on the basis of conditions like race. But that is nevertheless something that I often want to point out, that there is a major legal and political intervention here. And Carrie Chapman Catt and her legacy is something, again, that we start to think about to make, as I say here, the stories we tell about ourselves more complex and compelling. One more example, and again, we're starting to build out from the individual to broader topics. The other person I want to feature here is Edna Griffin. She's called the Rosa Parks of Des Moines, and she labored for decades for the civil rights movement in Iowa. She requested service at a segregated cafeteria in Des Moines in 1948. Notably, this came 7 years before Rosa Parks's celebrated refusal to move to the back of a bus in the South. So I do think that this really helps us rethink the history of civil rights and perhaps put Iowa at the center of that movement. Ultimately, her legal suits and sit-ins were successful in making businesses obey Iowa's public accommodations law. She was a Fisk University graduate and devoted her life to the civil rights movement. In 1963, she organized Iowans to join Martin Luther King's famous March on Washington. She also began the Des Moines chapter of the Congress of Racial Equality, which supported voter registration drives in the South. And for many years, she had a column that appeared regularly in Iowa's publication called the Iowa Bystander. She was active in peace and other human rights efforts. She was also born in Kentucky in 1909, grew up in New Hampshire on a farm, and moved to Des Moines in 1947. And she was inducted in Iowa Women's Hall of Fame in 1985. And here you can see her, if you can see the screen, during her service in the Women's Army Corps at Fort Des Moines during World War II. Another astounding figure, not only who helps us better understand Iowa's history, but also the history of civil rights, as I've suggested, not just positioning civil rights as a Southern movement among mostly male, maybe religious leaders, but one that started with women like Edna Griffin, who began campaigns locally and within statewide initiatives. So where do we go from these three women as these wonderful examples of ways that we can understand gender in Iowa? Well, I want to give you a little background about scholarship on gender in Iowa. Most of the scholarship, and we'll look at some of it today, has explored the topic within existing historiographical narratives. There's a large number of works that focus on European and American settlement. There's another that looks at agricultural development, and there's quite a bit in there about labor and gender. And then the growth of small towns also has focused on gender as well. Now, this scholarship challenges narratives when we look at it through the lens of gender, because it demands that these existing narratives that have taken away or ignored gender, it demands that they refocus on gendered analysis. And then one way it does this is by criticizing narrow assumptions that heteronormativity, which is just a fancy word that sort of means that there's this sense of a binary between male and female. And then patriarchy or patriarchal, which again assumes that there's sort of this male dominance system and structure. So when you combine those, we have assumptions that Iowa existed within this heteropatriarchal structure. And that was the dominant narrative and experience of gender because of this existing scholarship. Now, we have seen some of that. We will see examples as well of this. But the problem with this, when we take gender and apply it to existing historiographical narratives, the studies often have privileged whiteness. They've given a one-dimensional definition of the farm family, and they've assumed political and social conservatism that de-emphasized radical views. None of the three women that I just profiled necessarily fit in these earlier historiographical treatments. So in other words, as much as scholarship on gender in Iowa has criticized a narrow heteropatriarchal structure, it has also then stayed closer to those topics. So part of the project of developing a historical field is complicating existing narratives, which is good, but as we'll see, we want to go beyond that heteropatriarchal structuring as an important next step in the evolution of scholarship on gender in Iowa. So we're going to do both of those things. We're going to look at the structures and the emergence of gender in Iowa history, and then also see some of the ways that it's continuing to evolve and hopefully will in the future. So let's trace this history of gender in Iowa to better understand how it developed and where it might go in the future. Some of the earliest scholarship on gender has looked at the experiences of women in Iowa. In fact, the three profiles that I gave you, all women, it's mostly because gender broadly came out of early interventions to bring women into the historical record. So some of the earliest scholarship comes from scholars like Ruth Gallagher and Louise Noun. Both of these individuals considered legal and political issues. Louise Noun's Strong-Minded Women is a classic. She focuses on the late 19th century movement to enfranchise women and profiled a number of key leaders from that period. Other women, other scholars have challenged historiographical assumptions that left out women or painted them in a negative light. One example is Glenda Riley's assessment of how white women experienced the frontier. Now, she's writing before the settler colonial paradigm emerged, but she disputed scholarship that portrayed quote unquote trail women as forlorn and beleaguered. Riley found that women on the trail were thoughtful and clear-headed about leaving their homes. In other words, they knew what they were doing. They experienced the same conditions as the men they were with, and they figured out how to camp, cook, and care for animals and children along the way. The narrative that they were weak and emotionally unstable, that was wrong. And her insights dovetailed with other emerging scholarship on rural white Iowans that gender complementarity, not unchecked patriarchal dominance, better characterized familial relationships. By the late 1980s and the early 1990s, historians studying gender in Iowa were offering important counterpoints to histories of women and agriculture, and also challenging gender theories themselves. This is a long group of scholars. I couldn't list them all, so I've given you just a few examples. Deborah Fink, Kathleen Jellison, Mary Neff, Lisa Ocean have all examined shifting labor structures within the farm economy, finding that productive technologies and markets made gender roles fluid. They also found that while white Iowans might have ascribed to the notion of separate spheres, this notion says that there are two spheres. There's a private sphere in the home, which is only for women or mostly for women. And then there's a public sphere, which is outside the home, and this is primarily for men. This is where business happens, and business doesn't happen in the home. This binary, these scholars have found, white Iowans might say, oh, sure, that sounds great, but it fails to capture over and over again the centrality of women's work on the family farm, or after World War II, when they increasingly took off farm work. This scholarship, to me, is so important. It disrupts this notion of the devaluing of women's work. One of the interventions that these scholars and others have made is in terms of the money generated by women on farms. You may have heard people talk about pin money or egg money. And it's sort of this like, oh yeah, it's a supplemental on the side sort of thing. And it's good, it helps out, but it's not the profit-making agricultural production that's happening either with livestock or crop production. And a lot of scholars have said, wait a minute, that's not true. If you look at farm record books, you see very clearly where this egg money, this would be money generated by poultry raising or sometimes in dairy as well, with butter or milk, selling this to local grocers or merchants. Women actually not just supplemented, but they actually often could pay more, especially during times where there could be environmental issues that decreased agricultural production, maybe a flood, maybe a drought. And that money was essential. It was not something on the side, but it actually kept the family afloat. That intervention is really key to thinking about the gender division of labor on the farm. It's not something where, again, the idea that women are just sort of ancillary, they're working in the home mostly, maybe they go out into the barn or over to check on the chickens, that's just sort of this less valuable role, when in fact it was, they were doing much more than that. They were out in the fields, they were riding on tractors, they were doing a lot of work alongside the men in their families, but they're also, that work that they were doing in those barns and in those chicken coops was essential to family survival as well. And then I also note here, and you can see a great image, this is a woman named Betty Goodall in 1950, and here she's working as a secretary. She is what we would call a farm wife. She would be living on the farm, but driving to a local office. And especially after World War II, as agribusiness is really consolidating and putting pressure on small farms, women's off-farm work, once again, just like egg money, really pushed forward the survival of family farms into the mid and then later 20th century. So it's not something that is just done because they want to get away from the farm. Sometimes that's true, but it's actually crucial to the farm economy itself. And I think that's something where when we think about these technologies and the roles that are assigned with them, that's something that's really key. I'd be happy in the question and answer as well to talk about Kathleen Jellison's and others' work about the purchasing. Kathleen Jellison does a good job of talking about how women fought for things like washing machines, while men were fighting for the mechanization of their planting operations or livestock operations, for example. Women were not just sitting back and saying, oh yes, dear, I agree, we should buy all these things first. They would have conversations, they would have serious discussions about what was needed, and they would raise often their own interests of the home and see success in getting those pieces of household technology that would alleviate the household labor, or at least change the demands on them so that they could either participate more in the farm operation or get off the farm work. All right. So that is yet another way where we see gender reshaping ways we think about Iowa history. We have another group of scholars represented here in a part of the field that has traced the ways in which women have become activists, or at least engaged prominently in their communities, either urban or small town. One, a man named Thomas Moraine, he traced the history of Jefferson, Iowa from 1900 to 1930. And he noted how the community changed as farm economies shifted during the Great Depression. And of course, before that, World War I, and after the Great Depression, World War II. There were also during this period massive changes in terms of domestic and international markets that also reconfigured how people understood themselves in their small towns, is also part of this larger national and international context, especially an economic one. So there's lots of disruption, is what Moraine is saying. And in this, many white women banded together to form civic clubs that created public institutions like libraries and schools so that people could come together, find meaning in their communities, and help each other out. For the three scholars that you see there, gender was a primary organizer of community life. It's as important as economic networks, farm livelihoods, and politics. And I especially like Maureen's insistence that we have to take gender seriously when it comes to understanding small towns. People organize themselves in small towns around gender. For Sharon Wood and her study of Gilded Age women in Davenport, she found women struggling to contend with changing urban climates, especially in the early 20th century, the rising number of prostitutes and impoverished working class women. And Hope Mitchell also found that as well, a flourishing red light district in East Des Moines, and many women not sure or wanting to do something, but not sure exactly what the solution might be. In these cases, we see women coming together and forming these clubs, essentially to try to make their communities better, some sort of civic responsibility to themselves and to others in their communities, to uplift their communities and help those the most underrepresented or unfortunate. This, I think, is key to understanding the ways in which women in Iowa, especially white women, begin to see their activism. It stems from their identities in their communities as civic leaders. And so they begin to agitate not just for benevolent homes, local institutions that will help either impoverished women or fallen women, as they called them, women who were engaged in prostitution. But they also start to think about broader trends that are putting these women in these positions in the first place. And alongside their activism in these causes, they're also engaging in temperance, which is not just a local, but also a state and national movement. It's actually the largest national movement among women at this time, and really it's unrivaled even today in terms of the number of women who were engaged in temperance activism. Another huge movement, which we've seen Carrie Chapman Catt here, is of course women's suffrage. A lot of these women start to argue that the reason they ought to vote is not necessarily because they see themselves as equal, or they see themselves as some part of a liberal, lowercase l, system in which rights for all are paramount. They don't see that. What they say is that they are responsible citizens. They are good citizens. They are loyal to their communities, they're loyal to their nation, and that they deserve the right to vote to make sure that they can perpetuate their initiatives. So it's not an individual claiming out of a rights-based argument. It's actually much more infused in the community itself. So when we think about gender as a primary organizer of community in Iowa, it of course helps us better understand how activism on behalf of these causes flourished out of those identities. And I'd be happy to talk more about that, as it is something that I've spent a lot of time working on. One more point here. What's striking to me is that when these women were working, there's both clinging desperately to traditional gender values. They want to sort of, especially in the case of prostitutes, stop them from doing that work and start getting them into these sort of normative frameworks of gender. But in doing so, the clinging desperately actually reveals their fragility. The truth was that Iowans flouted gender expectations frequently and publicly. The political work of these white civic female leaders, these leaders who called for radical economic and political restructuring through policy and legislation, was as much evidence of that usurpation of those gender norms as the preponderance of prostitutes they sought to uplift. In the case of Davenport, these women were not very successful in the end to try to help these women, in part because of the fragility of these gender norms, but also because of the radical nature of their demands. So Iowa's historiography about gender also includes intersectional approaches, which uncover how other identities overlapped and informed gendered ones. And again, I just have a few scholars listed here, but there are many more. So one example, Linda Clemens, she argues that after the US Dakota War of 1862, Mostly male Dakota exiles from Minnesota came to Davenport as prisoners, while the federal government removed their families, the women and children, to the Crow Creek Reservation in Dakota Territory. So using a lens of gender, they essentially created punishment for the entire family structure and the entire community of Dakota. The Dakota suffered violence, humiliation, and mistreatment, according to Clemens, but they also demonstrated resilience, resistance, and survival. And I would note here that it's not just the Dakota, but it's many, many other Indigenous groups who lived and continue to live in Iowa and shape its history and have shaped its history in profound ways. Their resilience, their engagement with local economies, with state economies, with politics is something that when we look at gender, we can start to understand the ways in which their resilience met that mistreatment that they faced. Leslie Schwalm revealed how formerly enslaved Black migrants built institutions and sought full citizenship while navigating white ridicule in Iowa. They demonstrated respectability, which means that they did, in fact, try to uphold gender norms of this sense that they are respectable, good citizens, just as their white counterparts. They did so because they wanted to claim their right to live and prosper in the state. So they use an explicitly gendered approach to inclusion, one that did not necessarily disrupt the binary of male female. In fact, they sought to reify it. But in doing so, it was a radical contestation of the white supremacy that they were seeking to thwart. Another scholar whose work is wonderful and important to this topic of intersectionality is Dorothy Schwieter. She examined how coal mining, second only to agriculture, brought Italian and Croatian immigrants, as well as Black Americans, to the state. One community that she profiled was Buxton, Iowa. Mining families importantly relied on income from a variety of jobs. They saw the family economy as one that was inclusive of both men and women. And it included, their work that they did included livestock raising, gardening, boarding, and midwifery, which sometimes confused gender in the process. So just like scholars looking at white women in agricultural production have noted that egg money or off-farm work was instrumental to the farm family survival and the farm economy, so too did Dorothy Schwieter point to these mining families and the ways in which gender did not necessarily create a tidy division of labor and valuation of that labor. And then my work on racializing immigrants during the women's suffrage movement in Iowa illuminates how native-born suffrage activists developed a key strategy to convince Iowans to support the right to vote for women during World War I. So essentially, in World War I, we see decades of nativism or xenophobia that had been fomenting as more and more immigrants had come to Iowa and to the Midwest more broadly. It erupts in about 1914, 1915, and in Iowa, 1916, during the only woman suffrage state campaign. What happens is the movement failed, the amendment did not pass and did not become part of the state constitution. And in that wake, white woman suffrage activists blamed, in this case, immigrants or German American immigrants for what they said was ignorance, backwardness, and unfitness when it came to vote. Those words are code words. They were used by white suffragists in the South to describe Black men who had the right to vote, although it was decreasing in number from the late 19th to early 20th century. So those code words are racialized terms that indicate that for these white suffragists, they were making the case that Germans could not be trusted, that they were somehow inferior because of their immigrant status or generational immigrant status. And as I argue in my work, it worked for these women. They were able to secure eventually the 19th Amendment. Midwest very happily came out for it when it came time to ratify the 19th Amendment. And in part, it was because of the turn against immigrants that made women's suffrage seem like the antidote to dealing with these Germans or German American, so second generation voters whom they feared were going to elect candidates that would destroy democracy from within. And this goes alongside a lot of fear, a lot of xenophobia at the time that said that Germans were plotting to destroy the war movement. There are lots of conspiracy theories floating around at that time. And women suffragists largely tapped into that and said, yeah, this is why you ought to give us white women, native born white women, the right to vote. And so that's something else that we see when we think of these intersectional identities that connect gender with questions of ethnicity. Okay. For all this work, which has been a lot and it has grown remarkably, as I've said, we see lots of extensive chronologies. We see lots of really important scholarship that, as we've seen, still resonates. We also note that there are significant gaps that remain. Iowa's veneer of homogeneity has masked contradictions that abound when people frequently reconstitute and reconfigure gender identities, relations, and hierarchies through much of Iowa's history. Think back to the first three women that we talked about in the story and how they were working to reconstitute their identities and relationships in sometimes radical ways. One key issue that you see here are LGBTQ Iowans and their history. We need much more scholarship on this topic. And one of the things that I'm really curious to know more about is why these Iowans, LGBTQ Iowans, secured marriage equality in 2008. And that legal decision, I think, was no accident. So I think scholars must explore Iowa's LGBTQ histories better to explain why this decision occurred as it did. They could start at the LGBTQ Iowa Archives and Library, which opened fairly recently in Iowa City, or there's an LGBT oral history collection created by students and faculty at Grinnell College. These are just two of the resources that we have, but I'm hopeful that there will be even more as more of these stories begin to appear. Future studies promise to continue the work of scholars whose contributions of the past 4 decades have continued to pursue intersectionality in historical analyses. I think this is one of the topics I hope that we as historians will identify and consider more deeply, and not just 2008. I think we need to go back and find histories of LGBTQ Iowans from even before settlement. They are there. It's up to us to do the work to discover them. And I would also add, and this is more just so we have it planted if we'd like to talk about it in the Q&A, there could be lots more scholarship on the history of masculinity in Iowa as well. That is a topic that when we think about gender, we've done it through the lens of women's history. We have a lot of scholarship, but I think it would be worthwhile to reconsider as well histories of masculinity as part of this effort. So I will just end by saying, as historians increasingly account for how gender overlapped with sexuality, race, class, ethnicity, religion, industrial labor, and other factors, their scholarship will help us continue to reshape understandings not only of gender as a category of analysis, but also the history of Iowa. Gender asks us to question our assumptions, our categories, our labels, and systems. And I think using it continues to broaden and add complexity to the history of Iowa. Thank you very much for all of your time. And I'd love to open it up to any questions you might have.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Sarah. My name is Andrew, and I am going to be working through these questions with everyone today. I want to remind everyone that if you have questions, go ahead and drop those in the Q&A feature here in the Zoom chat or in the Zoom Q&A feature. I'll get to those. We may not have time to get to all of them, but we're going to get to as many as we can. Sarah's given us quite a bit of time for conversation. So I want to jump in with kind of the first question that I'm seeing here, and this is nicely dovetails with what you were just talking about, Sarah. And that's just asking about how, when we talk about gender history, often it's kind of code for women's history, right? And you've kind of mentioned that, but we actually, at the end, you were helping us see that it's actually LGBTQ history, it's histories of masculinity, things like that. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about some of the insights maybe that we would gain if we were to look at, say, masculinity. For example, I'm thinking about Jenny Barker Devine's work on women on the family farm, right? And how does understanding the bigger role that women had help us understand maybe the different role that men would have had, challenging maybe perceptions of men as domineering or individualistic, right? Like clearly they were in dynamic partnerships. Does that, trying to help make that question make sense? Does that make some sense?
No, I love that. And Jenny Barker Devine's work on agrarian feminisms, and then it's appeared in the annals a few times, and it's just remarkable. And her scholarship and scholarship like it, where it focuses on state and national farm organizations that were promoting the interests of the family farm, what she discovers is that women were instrumental in a lot of those movements to try to gain either a policy decision that would benefit the farm or just even more recognition. And so, one of the things that I think about, not just Jenny's work, but also other work that's happened is after before World War II even, when we see increasing mechanization on the farm, there is a radical moment for a lot of farmers that the physical labor, the use of the body is changing. And a lot of the ideas about masculinity that farmers in Iowa generated came from that physicality, came from the, using the plows and just being very active on the farms. And what ends up happening, especially as mechanization and the technology improves, what you see is farmers, all they have to do is push a button. And it's very disorienting for a lot of farmers. That masculine identity is, they put it in question. And there's been scholarship kind of broadly, and I think there should be more in terms of Iowa. What happens, as they call it, this push button farming? What happens to conceptions of farming and masculinity in Iowa? One of the conclusions broadly that scholars have reached, I'm thinking of Joe Anderson's work, was featured in Agricultural History a couple of years ago, is that they reconceptualize masculinity. And so instead of farmers out in the field wearing their field clothes, farmers become businessmen, and they wear suits, and they're very methodical, and they're bookkeepers, and they're like businessmen in that, yes, they don't work physically in the fields anymore, but they know how to manage their farm just as a businessman would, or even they literally are businessmen. So that idea that mechanization takes away the physicality is replaced by the idea that farmers are like businessmen managing their farm with a proper accounting. They go and they take classes. You major in some sort of agricultural major at Iowa State or other colleges that teaches you how to farm in these ways. So I think that is something that's worth exploring even more. And I'm thinking of that as well, because I know Pam Riney-Kerberg's book on the farm crisis in the 1980s is coming out. And I know there as well, we think about masculinity in that moment of crisis, connecting to this point of what happens when you can no longer manage your business effectively anymore in the face of this crisis or calamity in the farm economy. So I think there's a lot of work there. Again, people are doing it, but that question of, in this case, mechanization and the loss of that presence, I think that's the physical presence of farmers. I think that's something that deserves even more attention.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. And even I'm thinking, if you're thinking about farming in particular, masculinity, you have the increase, at least where I come from, I'm from Northwest Iowa, increasingly farm ownership. Land is owned increasingly by women, even if men are the ones who are farming. And I think about, like, my grandma, for example, owns a lot of the land that she then inherited, right? That my uncle now farms. So I wonder if if that's
Yes.
another angle, right? Is the increasing number of women who own farms, even if they do not farm them themselves, right?
Right. Yeah. So you, on the one hand, you see people then who's acknowledge that although the women own the land, they're not the managers, they're not making the business decisions. It's still largely left to men. Although there's also been a lot of scholarship looking at how women have actually taken a more proactive role. They've engaged with much more so organic farming, or kind of moving away from the standard like corn and hogs. That's like this trope, I think, a lot of times. And so again, I think if you actually peel that back and look at how women are like part of the decision-making process as the landowners, or as like your grandma, as a member of a family, they have those conversations and they can have the influence that will shift perhaps the farm production, and instead of having maybe a monoculture, having some more diversity. We've seen that. I think it's still emerging, but I do think that that's notable as well. The ways in which ownership is and management are different, but then it can be contested.
And there is that partnership, right? That helps us see gender in more complex ways, not just of women, but of men and the roles that they play. I think that's fascinating. Another question. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to add, the other thing that the USDA has noted is that when the average age of farmers, it's increasingly high. It's, like 60 something, 64, 65, something like that. And then as you creep up there, more women are the farm owner operator listed in their records. And it's sad, but it's because women are often outliving their husbands, and then they become, at that older age, the ones who are certainly carrying on their husband's legacies, but they're also now making those decisions themselves. So I think that's also, when we think of widowhood as a category within gendered analyses, we can see ways in which women once again disrupt those power dynamics.
It's fascinating. I could talk about all day, but we've got lots of questions, so we'll keep moving. Another question here that's interesting too is could you talk a little bit about the role of women in passing prohibition and then having that law later repealed or dropped?
Yes. I could talk too much. I will try to keep it brief. So Iowa, unlike other Midwestern states, its neighbors, especially Minnesota and South Dakota and Nebraska, those states had not as much interest in prohibition. Iowa had a lot of interest in prohibition comparatively. And in part, the argument is that there were not as many immigrants to the state, even though I've said that there was this perception that immigrants were bad later on in World War I. That perception is not actually grounded in significant numerical disparity. Iowa is founded, or is settled by white people, by people who come, especially in the areas that I've studied, kind of northern Iowa, people who come with interest in temperance and prohibition, people from the Northeast, or kind of the more Eastern Midwest, Ohio and Michigan, et cetera. So they come with this sense that prohibition or temperance generally, that those are good things, because they believe that the community functions best when people are sober. And they don't just mean people don't drink, that's obviously key, but what they mean is that people take their role in the community seriously. The other word that I often saw in the scholarship alongside sober is industrious or civically minded. So they're using sober, these temperance advocates, in a broader sense to mean people who are serious citizens, good citizens. And so temperance is a movement situated squarely in the middle of that political agitation, that you want people to be good, upright citizens who will contribute to their communities, especially in the late 19th century and early 20th century, as Iowa is growing economically and agriculturally. They want people who are going to participate in that economy and who are going to participate in politics. So they're very, and the culture, so they're very keen on, people are very keen on that. So women in Iowa were very, for the most part, very supportive of prohibition. There were certainly communities in the eastern part along the river that had more German influence. And those communities were, of course, the ones that white suffragists targeted when the 1916 Women's Suffrage Amendment failed. But by and large, again, kind of in a broad stroke, Iowans supported prohibition. And when what became the 18th Amendment passed, Iowa politicians were pretty eager. Now, it's not to say that before 1917, 1918, when these final ratifications were happening for the 18th Amendment, there hadn't been contested elections. There had been, in fact, in the primary, where the Women's Suffrage Amendment was on the ballot in 1916, it's June 5th, 1916, there was a whole issue because the governors, essentially people switched side because I'm going to get this wrong. I have to remember which one it was. The Republican gubernatorial candidate came out against prohibition. So the Democratic candidate came out for. I'm probably mixing these up. Anyway, the point is the expected candidate switched. So then the other candidate switched, and people actually reportedly changed their party affiliation to vote in the primary. You're also probably thinking primary. Iowa had primaries. Yes, at the time they did. And so this whole issue of prohibition in 1916, it sort of ruptured, made much more issue for that election because people were thinking about their vote, not for the gubernatorial candidate or maybe even a particular party, but a lot of people reportedly were voting because of their stance either for or against a supposed future coming prohibition amendment. And so in the end, the governor's name was Harding, and I can't remember what party he was in, but he ends up winning the election, and he was the guy who was against prohibition, and that sort of holds off for a little while, but then Iowa very generally swiftly goes pro-prohibition. And during the prohibition period, as we know, there was certainly underground operations or less underground operations, depending on your position. Some of this was fairly well known and just not well enforced. But women largely continue to pursue this crusade. I would say that Iowa women generally are very focused on this idea that people need to uphold the republic by being responsible citizens. And to do that is to abstain, follow the rules, be sober, as I said. I'm going to stop there only because I think I've talked about it enough. I'm happy to come back to it. There's so much in that, but yeah, I was very, in general, comparatively, for prohibition, much more so than other states.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds like women had a role in this, like in that process. So the next question from the 18th to the 19th Amendment is wondering if you could talk at all about Mary Jane Kagashall's contributions to the suffrage movement in Iowa and nationally. Is that a name that person you can speak to at all?
I can, although
okay.
I have to say it's been a little while since I have the details.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not going to, I apologize to the person who asked the question off the top of my head. I don't have it all, although there's plenty of resources, and I can put some resources in the in the information that comes afterwards. I'm happy to do that. What I do remember about her, she was active in the late 19th century. I believe she lived in Des Moines or right around Des Moines. And she was one of those leaders when the movement did not have a lot of broad support. There were a period, it's been contested, but historians kind of call it the doldrums. It's a period where there was just not a lot of forward momentum. Suffrage was considered one of the most, if not the most, radical political causes of the time. The idea that women could cast ballots was not just absurd to people, but downright undemocratic. A lot of people framed it in religious terms and said that this was not God's will. So it's very contested, just to kind of put it in those frames. And so Mary Jane Kagashall, she was one of those who continued to agitate. She would continue to lead the Iowa, first it was the Iowa Women's Suffrage Association, and then it became the Iowa Equal Suffrage Association in the 20th century. She would have meetings in her home, or she would organize meetings. She wrote quite extensively, and she maintained the network of activists. So she was one who was kind of the guiding light. She died before the 19th Amendment was passed, but a lot of Iowa's kind of second generation suffragists who were around when it passed credited her. They said she was the one who kept the flame going, so to speak, when others thought it's a lost cause. It's never going to happen. So that's what I would sort of briefly say about her. Just a tremendous, very important woman to the history, and brought, not just a woman, but an activist, someone we think about as really a savvy political leader.
Perfect. I think that's a good kind of introduction. I'm sure that you could point to more sources to more, like if for the person who asked the question, like
I will add more. Louise Noun's book gets into more detail, but there there are some other sources that go into more detail than I did. Yeah,
great. Wonderful. Well, we've got about 5 minutes left, so we'll do another question or maybe two. We'll see. But I wanted to ask for you, like, when you kind of have done your own research, have you had a favorite source that you found, or a kind of thing that really kind of opened up these questions of gender to you as you went about your work?
Yes, and Andrew, you're going to like this answer because for me, one of my favorite sources are church histories, because sometimes they are very straightforward. You know, here were the pastors and here were the buildings, right? They document this very kind of institutional history of the leaders and the buildings and those sorts of things. But often women wrote their own histories because they were the leaders of their churches. And so what I love is finding the sections in these church histories where clearly the women are calling the shots and they're telling it like it is. They're not, this is not a bad mouthing situation, but they are not concerned about the pastors and the length of those pastoral tenures. What they care about is the work that the women did in the churches. All of the dinners, all of the bazaars, the suppers, all of the fundraising efforts. And they not only document these, but so many of these church histories also say exactly how much money they made. And then they say what they did with that. And what's remarkable is if you look at the church leadership in many churches in Iowa, often, especially 100 years ago, it was male. And so they're claiming, we put a new bell tower in our church, or we installed new pews, and we did all these, look at us, we're the leaders and we did this. But if you look at what the women are doing in their records, they're the ones that raised the money for those pews and for that bell tower. And so they're actually saying, yeah, you might say that you did this, but we know we actually did all the work and it was our money. We didn't just hand it over to you and then you decided. They very clearly are claiming that space. And what I loved, it sort of clicked for me, talking with my mentor at Iowa State, Pamela Riney-Kerberg, trying to figure out how do I make the connection from these women in churches to women's suffrage. And I realized when suffrage activists, suffrage speakers came to these small towns, where did they speak? They spoke in their churches. They would go in the pulpits and they would give these pro-women suffrage speeches. And I thought, oh my gosh, these women literally built these buildings and now they are inviting these activists to come in. It's a complete rethinking about, first of all, any sort of divide between the sort of religious space and the political space, which I think is fascinating itself, but that these women not only owned it, but then they use that sense of ownership to essentially become activists in their own communities. And to me, that was a source that just reshaped how I thought about gender, what it looks like on the outside, but what's actually happening internally in terms of the system is much more profound than we often give it credit for. This is why I say Iowa is not a middle land. I'll throw that in. I don't think that Iowa is a place where everyone gets along and it's all kind of in the middle, it's bland. No, Iowa is a place where people engage with radical ideas in radical ways and use gender as a way to really develop those broad movements and identities. So yeah. put that in. I know it's almost done, but
Yeah,
I
no,
felt
that's
like
great. I think
it
it's a terrific, terrific place to wrap things up too. That'll have been our last question too, looking at the time. But gosh, this was a lot of fun, and I feel I say that we could stay and talk about this forever, and you and I actually have spent hours talking about these things. So
yes, we
that's
have.
terrific. Well, with that answer though, I think that's going to bring our webinar to a close. I want to thank everyone for joining us, and I want to say especially thank you to you, Sarah. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you here. We hope that everyone will sign up for Iowa History 101s that take place again on the second and fourth Thursdays throughout the year. There's so many great stories about Iowa's past to tell that are coming up for the upcoming months, and you can see our past programs as well. For more information or to register for future webinars in this series, check out our website, iowaculture.gov. This webinar and past presentations are available on that website as well. While you are there, you can look over some of our other fantastic digital programs, such as the Goldie's Kids Club activities for young historians, and watch video recordings of the Iowa Stories series hosted by our Iowa City branch. We look forward to seeing you virtually on August 25th. And thank you so much for joining us. Have a great afternoon.